No one expected this. A single midnight decision has sent shockwaves through the industrial heart of North America. As President Trump doubled tariffs on foreign metals, Canada responded with a move so sharp, so targeted, that Detroit's assembly line staggered before sunrise. In an instant, 25% of the steel America depended on simply vanished. Freight cars stopped. Cross-border deliveries halted. Welders, engineers, and factory owners all faced the same brutal realization: the lifeline had been cut. Canada's message was clear: the era of being Washington's resource bank was over. From now on, Canadian steel stays home. A radical new policy dictated that domestic steel would fuel domestic growth: wind turbines, hydrogen plants, pipelines. Every coil once bound for the U.S. would now be redirected toward billion-dollar green projects north of the border. And Ottawa's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, wasn't finished. In a televised address, he unveiled a billion-dollar clean steel initiative and slapped a mirror 50% surcharge on exports that exceeded 2024 volumes. That move instantly created a gaping hole in the American supply chain. The U.S. had imported over 6 million tons of steel from Canada the previous year, nearly 1/4 of its total supply. Without it, prices surged. Within hours, hot-rolled coil shot up 6%, hitting $910 a ton, the steepest single-day increase in the year. Detroit's factories were rattled. General Motors was forced to slash billions from its profit projections for 2025. Ford followed suit, raising vehicle prices by up to $2,000, blaming a looming $2.5 billion tariff cost. Wall Street took notice. Goldman Sachs downgraded its auto sales forecast, predicting Americans would simply stop buying new vehicles if prices kept climbing. The impact cascaded. Construction projects funded by federal infrastructure plans warned of delays, rising costs, and penalties. Bridge components couldn't be sourced. Assembly lines were paralyzed. Even the Pentagon's procurement was affected. And in the background, a more complex game was playing out. As the U.S. tried to project strength through tariffs, Canada used those very policies to spark its own industrial revolution. Ottawa's strategy was ruthless but calculated. Absorb the short-term shock, reinvest in green steel, and turn American buyers into unwilling funders of Canada's energy transition. Each ton of steel that once crossed the Ambassador Bridge would now be forged into the framework of Canada's low-carbon economy. And while American factories scrambled for alternatives, Canada expanded its lead. Over 80 low-emissions hydrogen and wind projects were greenlit nationwide, with construction orders for turbine hubs and electrolyzers already locked in for years ahead. Steel, once just a commodity, had become a weapon, one that cut deeper than anyone anticipated. With a single tariff war, the U.S. didn't just lose imports, it lost leverage. The question ringing through every boardroom from Michigan to Ohio was the same: how do you build electric trucks when the steel is being welded into another nation's future? On the factory floors, the tension became unbearable. A broken die at Ford's Wayne plant halted production for 700 vehicles. Replacement parts sat idle in Canada, untouchable unless someone paid a 50% fee at the border. And there was no backup plan. Not in time. Not at that scale. Not at that cost. As America struggled, Ottawa doubled down. Canada's new requirement mandated that at least 60% of the steel in every federally funded green project be made domestically. That policy alone redirected hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, enough to starve entire U.S. manufacturing sectors. Even a single offshore wind farm could now absorb more Canadian metal than Detroit used in a quarter. This wasn't retaliation by accident. It was designed. Strategic. Timed. And with deadlines looming for international environmental targets, Canada had every reason to lock in demand for its steel domestically. Every turbine, every pipeline, every hydrogen hub now had Canada's stamp on it. And while American politicians defended the tariffs as a protectionist measure, the results painted a different picture. Prices skyrocketed, jobs were threatened, and critical infrastructure faced delays. U.S. carmakers began to panic. Some plants were forced to reduce shifts. Others stockpiled high-cost materials. All while voters, the very workers tariffs were supposed to protect, were left watching layoffs and inflation eat away at their livelihoods. The irony was painful. The promise to protect American industry was threatening to destroy it from within. And in Geneva, a new battle was brewing. Legal teams prepared to argue whether Canada's export quota was a legitimate defense or a covert attack on free trade. The U.S., having used the National Security Clause to justify its tariffs, now found itself cornered. If Washington challenged Ottawa's move, it risked undermining its own legal arguments in multiple trade disputes already under review. Carney made his position clear. Canada wasn't dumping steel. It was prioritizing national needs, just like the U.S. claimed it was doing. The quota, he said, would vanish the moment tariffs did. A simple trade, fairness for fairness. But with election season approaching, Trump's team hesitated. Rolling back tariffs could be seen as weakness. Holding them, however, came with real consequences, especially for swing state industries on the brink. Behind the headlines and political speeches, a quiet transformation was underway. Canadian steel producers, long dependent on American buyers, began shifting their gaze overseas. South Korea, Japan, and even Germany entered new negotiations with Canadian suppliers, eager to secure access to clean, traceable steel for their energy transitions. For the first time in decades, Canadian metal was no longer shaped to fit American molds. It was being forged to fuel a global shift. This redirection wasn't just economic. It was cultural. Canadian unions, once skeptical of decoupling from the U.S. market, began to embrace a new national doctrine: resilience through independence. Factory managers in Ontario and Alberta reported the same refrain: fewer border delays, more predictable contracts, better margins. For many, the decision to cut steel exports wasn't retaliation. It was liberation. Meanwhile, in the U.S., things were unraveling faster than anyone expected. Midwest manufacturers, caught between shrinking inventories and climbing prices, scrambled for alternatives. Domestic producers couldn't scale fast enough to meet demand. Imports from Asia were too slow, too expensive, or too politically sensitive. And Mexican suppliers, wary of escalating trade tension, kept their shipments cautious. The Pentagon faced an unprecedented dilemma: whether to revise sourcing rules for critical defense materials. Contracts for armored vehicle chassis and naval hull components depended on Canadian suppliers. Now, every delivery carried a premium. Some procurement officers openly questioned whether supply chain continuity could be maintained through the next fiscal year. And the political cost was mounting. In states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, all key battlegrounds, layoffs surged. Not in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Tool and die shops, previously humming with electric vehicle retooling, began shutting down third shifts. Assembly line workers, promised protection, were now handed pink slips. In town halls, constituents demanded answers. Mayors pleaded with Washington. And behind closed doors, lobbyists drafted emergency relief packages that had little chance of passing in a deadlocked Congress. But even if Washington acted, it wouldn't solve the root problem. America had taken for granted the quiet loyalty of its northern neighbor. Decades of supply chain integration had created the illusion of permanence, that Canadian steel would always be there, no matter the policy. That illusion shattered. In Canada, a new doctrine emerged: resource sovereignty. Politicians invoked it to justify hard quotas, environmental priorities, and domestic-first mandates. Steel was now considered a strategic asset, not just a commodity. That reclassification gave Ottawa political cover to prioritize green infrastructure over exports, even when contracts had to be renegotiated or scrapped. And in the background, China watched. With the US locked in tariff disputes and Europe facing internal constraints, China quietly increased its influence in regions hungry for capital and materials. The Belt and Road Initiative resumed momentum. Infrastructure deals reappeared in South America and Africa. And in a twist few expected, several nations began importing processed Canadian steel, not directly, but through China-backed intermediaries operating in third countries. By doing so, Canada maintained its sovereignty, avoided direct entanglement in geopolitical rivalries, and still expanded its industrial footprint, all while the US fell further behind. The longer the tariffs remained, the deeper the consequences became. Freight logistics backed up. Warehouses in the Midwest ran empty. Even construction firms building public schools and hospitals found themselves priced out of basic components. And the psychological impact, that creeping awareness that America might not be in control anymore, began to set in. For decades, Washington had treated economic power as a weapon. Tariffs, sanctions, threats, these were tools used to enforce policy. But now, those tools were boomeranging. Canada, a quiet ally for over a century, had learned how to hit back, not with noise, but with precision. Not with protests, but with policy. And it worked. This wasn't just about steel. It was about a shifting balance. A slow-motion unraveling of assumptions that had defined North American commerce for generations. A reminder that loyalty cannot be commanded through coercion. It must be earned and maintained. And if Washington doesn't change course, what happened with steel could happen with aluminum, with rare earths, with lithium, with clean energy tech. This fracture is deepening. And this is only the beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the steel crisis became something larger, a symbol of fractured leadership and failing diplomacy. American investors began pulling back from long-standing industrial ventures. Pension funds reevaluated exposure to domestic manufacturing. Economists revised GDP forecasts, and central bank officials quietly warned that inflationary pressures linked to raw materials could spill into the broader economy. All while global competitors filled the void. Germany, already deep into its clean energy transition, began sourcing Canadian steel for hydrogen transport infrastructure. Japan negotiated favorable long-term supply deals for wind farm components. Even India, once largely reliant on Chinese imports, approached Canadian exporters with new trade offers, all while the United States sat idle, paralyzed by political infighting. Inside the White House, officials scrambled to contain the fallout. Some advisors urged Trump to double down, to show strength by raising tariffs further. Others warned that escalation could trigger a full trade war with G7 allies, tanking U.S. credibility just as global trust was already in decline. Trump, caught between nationalist optics and economic consequences, lashed out publicly. He called Canada's actions hostile, labeling the export cuts a betrayal. But behind closed doors, the mood was far less confident. Internal memos revealed deep concern about the ripple effects on everything from military readiness to hospital construction. In Canada, the public mood was different. Polls showed overwhelming support for Carney's move. For the first time in decades, Canadians saw their nation outmaneuvering the U.S. not through rhetoric, but through strategy. Steel towns that had once feared collapse were now thriving under domestic investment. Plants were modernizing. Youth employment rose. The narrative had flipped. And that shift wasn't lost on other U.S. allies. Australia, weary of America's erratic trade behavior, began exploratory talks with Canada on resource sharing. The EU proposed a trilateral clean tech alliance with Canada and Japan. The world was recalibrating. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, moving around the United States instead of with it. Meanwhile, in states like Wisconsin and Missouri, the second-order effects took root. Farmers who depended on equipment made from now scarce steel couldn't repair tractors in time for harvest. Rural hospitals delayed expansions. Highway repair crews missed deadlines. And in urban cores, city councils postponed new public works, citing material costs and legal uncertainty around federal funding. The longer this went on, the more it revealed something deeper than just a trade dispute. It exposed a vulnerability in the American model, one built on the assumption that allies would always comply, that the U.S. could set the rules, break them, and still be followed. That world is gone. And while Washington argues about tariffs, the ground beneath it is shifting. Canada is not just reacting, it is building. Building a domestic green economy. Building global partnerships. Building resilience. All while the United States burns through political capital it may never get back. Every week that passes without a resolution increases the likelihood that American industry will face permanent damage. Supply chains don't wait. Once they move, they rarely return. And as global demand for low-emissions infrastructure accelerates, the nations that control clean steel, clean energy, and critical materials will lead the next century. The United States is discovering this too late. It tried to weaponize trade, but its ammunition is now being turned against it. The allies it once took for granted are becoming competitors. The partners it once led are becoming pioneers. And its own workers, the ones who were promised protection, are the ones now paying the highest price. Steel was just the beginning. This is only the beginning.